The Strait of Hormuz is starting to reopen, but that is not the same thing as saying the crisis is over. That is the most important place to begin. Because if you only follow the headline, the story sounds simple. A ceasefire took hold, a few tankers moved, and one of the world's most dangerous choke points is back in business. But that is not what this crisis actually revealed. What it revealed is something more serious. The modern global economy does not need a complete blockade of Hormuz to suffer a major shock. It only needs uncertainty, fear, a partially contested sea lane, rising insurance costs, and a market that no longer trusts that energy can move safely. And that is why this matters far beyond the Gulf. What has changed most recently is real, but limited. 3 very large crude carriers have now exited the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, using a trial passage that avoids one of the most sensitive areas near Larak Island. The U.S. military says it is now setting conditions for safer transit and preparing routes that can be used more reliably by commercial shipping. Direct U.S.-Iran talks have also begun in Islamabad, which by itself is a significant development after decades of hostility and indirect confrontation. So yes, something has changed. The strait is not frozen in the same way it was days ago. But none of that means normality has returned. Just 2 days earlier, shipping traffic through Hormuz was still at a tiny fraction of normal levels. Instead of the usual heavy flow of ships, only a handful passed through over a 24-hour period. Commercial operators were still treating the route as deeply unsafe. The maritime threat assessment was still at the highest level. Major shipping companies were warning that even if the ceasefire holds, their networks would not recover quickly. Some estimated it would take 6 to 8 weeks just to untangle the backlog. That is the real distinction here. A few coordinated transits prove movement is possible. They do not prove confidence has returned. And confidence is the real strategic issue. To understand why, you have to understand what Hormuz actually is. At its narrowest point, this is a passage only 29 nautical miles wide, with extremely tight, navigable channels for inbound and outbound traffic. Yet through that narrow corridor moves roughly 20.9 million barrels of oil per day. That is about 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. It also carries about 11.4 billion cubic feet per day of liquefied natural gas trade, most importantly from Qatar and the UAE. In other words, this is not just a regional shipping lane, it is one of the central pressure points of the world economy. And it is not easy to replace. There are pipelines that can bypass Hormuz, especially in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but their combined bypass capacity is far below the total volume that normally moves through the strait. That means a prolonged disruption does not simply reduce efficiency, it creates a physical bottleneck. Even worse, much of the world's spare oil production capacity is in the Gulf itself, especially in Saudi Arabia. So, in a crisis, some of the barrels the world would want to rely on are trapped behind the same choke point that is under threat. That is what makes Hormuz uniquely dangerous. It is not just a place where oil moves, it is a place where the world's emergency flexibility can get stuck. That is why this crisis was never just about whether Iran could literally seal the strait shut. The deeper lesson is that control can be exercised through ambiguity, through warnings, through conditional access, through the threat of mines, even before mines are definitively confirmed, through a commercial environment where ship owners do not know what rules apply, where insurers sharply reprice risk, and where traders suddenly have to think not only about supply, but about whether supply can move at all. A choke point like Hormuz does not have to be fully closed to become coercive. It only has to become uncertain enough that the market begins to doubt its reliability. And once that doubt sets in, the effects spread fast. Oil was the most visible channel, but it was not the only one. Insurance premiums for transiting the region surged dramatically. Benchmark freight rates for very large crude carriers jumped. Physical oil markets tightened even while futures markets sometimes relaxed on ceasefire headlines. That is a crucial point. The paper market and the real logistics market were not telling the same story. Financial traders could price in diplomacy. Tanker operators, refiners, and physical buyers still had to price in actual risk. That gap between headline relief and physical scarcity is one of the clearest signs of how fragile the system became, and the inflation story matters here too. People often talk about oil shocks as if they affect only gasoline, but Hormuz influences much more than pump prices. When shipping costs rise, when insurance surges, when LNG flows are threatened, when fertilizer shipments are disrupted, the shock moves into electricity, food inputs, transport, aviation, manufacturing, and inflation expectations. In the United States, direct dependence on oil moving through Hormuz is relatively limited compared with Asia, but that does not mean the US is insulated. Oil is globally priced. If the market fears a choke point disruption, American consumers still feel it. Europe feels it. Asia feels it even more directly, and central banks feel it through the return of supply-side inflation risk at the exact moment many economies were already struggling with weak growth and political fatigue. That is why the phrase "Hormuz is reopening" is too shallow to explain what just happened. Because the real story is not whether ships can technically pass. The real story is whether the world still believes this route is a dependable foundation for energy security. And right now, that question is not fully answered. Several things remain unresolved. First, the ceasefire may be real, but its durability is not guaranteed. Diplomatic talks are happening, and that is significant, but the negotiating positions remain far apart. Iran is tying maritime access and broader de-escalation to larger political and economic issues. The United States is focused on restoring navigation and containing wider escalation. Lebanon remains a live spoiler. Regional actors still have the ability to disrupt any diplomatic opening. So the military temperature may be lower than it was, but the political settlement is not yet mature. Second, the security environment at sea remains uncertain. U.S. officials are talking about setting conditions for safer transit and possible mine-clearing operations. But public reporting has also shown lingering ambiguity over whether all the reported mine threats were confirmed, how extensive the hazard is, and what shipping companies will actually accept as sufficient security. That ambiguity matters, because insurers and operators do not price based on hopeful statements. They price based on worst-case scenarios. Third, commercial confidence has not yet recovered. This is one of the most underappreciated parts of the story. Governments can declare a route open. Navies can escort selected vessels. But normal commerce only returns when ship owners, charterers, insurers, and port operators all believe the risk is manageable and the rules are clear. Until then, every movement remains exceptional rather than routine. And exceptional movement is not the same thing as system recovery. Fourth, sanctions and policy risk are still hanging over the region. Even if maritime security improves, financial restrictions, asset disputes, and changes in export permissions can still tighten the market. So the next shock may not come from missiles or mines. It may come from policy. All of that brings us to the most important strategic takeaway. This crisis exposed not just a supply vulnerability, but a confidence vulnerability at the heart of globalization. For years, the world has operated on the assumption that critical flows of energy and trade will keep moving through narrow and exposed corridors, backed by naval protection, commercial routines, and market habit. Hormuz showed how thin that assumption can be. The system did not break because the world ran out of oil. It came under pressure because the movement of oil became doubtful. That is a different kind of fragility. And in some ways it is more troubling, because it means disruption can happen before formal closure, before open war, before governments fully understand what is happening. In other words, the leverage lies not only in blocking the artery, but in making everyone fear that the artery may not be dependable tomorrow. So what should we watch next? The first indicator is simple: daily traffic counts. Not symbolic movement, not a few escorted departures, but sustained normalization in tanker, LNG, and container traffic. The second is insurance and freight pricing. If risk premiums remain elevated, that tells you the commercial market still does not trust the reopening. The third is official maritime threat guidance. If threat levels remain critical, then headlines about reopening should be treated with caution. The fourth is the physical energy market itself: crude differentials, refined product tightness, LNG pricing, and fuel availability. Those will tell you more than front-month oil futures alone. The fifth is diplomacy. If the US-Iran talks begin producing concrete, verifiable arrangements around safe passage, de-escalation, and financial relief, then the crisis may genuinely be moving into a more stable phase. If not, this may only be a pause. And that is the frame to end on. The Strait of Hormuz may be starting to reopen, but the crisis already delivered its message. A narrow waterway, under contested conditions, was enough to shake oil markets, rattle shipping, revive inflation fears, and remind the world that global stability still depends on a handful of vulnerable corridors. So the real question is no longer whether Hormuz can be declared open. The real question is whether the world can trust it again. Because in geopolitics, confidence is infrastructure, and when confidence breaks, the shock travels much farther than the battlefield.